The room had no name. It existed in the deepest level of the Galactic Council's primary facility, a place that did not appear on any public map, was not mentioned in any official document, and had been visited by fewer beings than had walked on the surface of a dying star. The walls were smooth white alloy. The floor was smooth white alloy. The ceiling was smooth white alloy. There were no windows. There were no decorations. There was nothing in the room that was not completely, precisely necessary. In the center of the room, a single chair. In front of the chair, at a distance of exactly 12 feet, a weapon mounted on a fixed platform, sleek, black, charged, the kind of weapon that did not leave marks, the kind that went through armor and bone and everything else with equal indifference, the kind that, at this range, would absolutely kill whatever it was pointed at. Around the edges of the room, behind a transparent barrier that had been tested to withstand pressures that would collapse a small moon, 17 of the most senior scientists in the Galactic Council stood in absolute silence. 17 species, 17 different forms of intelligence that had taken millions of years each to develop. Every one of them holding a data recorder, every one of them watching. In the chair, Sergeant Elena Vasquez. 34 years old, dark hair pulled back, a small scar above her right eyebrow from something that had happened on a planet whose name most of the scientists in this room would not be able to pronounce. Brown eyes that were currently moving around the room with the calm, systematic attention of someone who was cataloging exits and threats and distances the way other people breathe, without thinking about it, because it had long since stopped being something that required thought. She was wearing standard human military fatigues, no armor, no weapons, exactly as requested. She looked at the weapon pointed at her face from 12 feet away. She looked at the 17 scientists behind the barrier. She looked back at the weapon. "So," she said. Her voice was completely normal, the voice of someone asking about the weather, or the time, or whether there was coffee available somewhere in this facility. "You're going to shoot me." The lead scientist, a Zothari elder named Counselor Veth, 7 feet tall, 4 arms, 3 eyes, the kind of calm that comes from spending 200 years doing very precise work, spoke through the communication panel in the barrier. "The weapon will fire in 60 seconds, Counselor Veth said. "You are aware of this. You are aware that the weapon will cause significant physical harm at this range. You are aware that you cannot stop it from firing. The only variable is your response." "And you want to see if I run," Elena said. "We want to see," Counselor Veth said carefully, "what you do." Elena nodded slowly. She looked at the weapon again. 45 seconds. Around the room, the 17 scientists leaned forward almost imperceptibly, data recorders active, biometric scanners running, the most sophisticated detection equipment in the known galaxy pointed at one human soldier in a chair. 30 seconds. Elena rolled her neck, left side, right side, the small vertebral pop of someone who did this habitually. 20 seconds. Her breathing slowed, not from fear, from something else, something the biometric scanners recorded with the confused energy of instruments encountering data they did not have a category for. 10 seconds. Counselor Veth watched her. In 200 years of doing this work, testing this ability in species from across the known galaxy, he had seen many things in that chair. He had seen warriors. He had seen philosophers. He had seen beings who had trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. Every single one of them had moved when the weapon fired. 5 seconds. Elena Vasquez looked at the weapon. And then she looked sideways at the young Pleerin lab assistant who had moved 2 steps closer to the barrier to get a better look at the readings and was now standing, without realizing it, directly beside the transparent barrier, in the exact projected path of the weapon's discharge if it passed through or around the chair. 1 second. The weapon fired, and every scanner in the room went insane simultaneously. The narrator's voice came in, low, deliberate. The Galactic Council had been running this test for 3,000 years. In 3,000 years, no species had ever passed it. They were wrong about what passing looked like. To understand why, we need to go back, 6 weeks earlier, to the day Sergeant Elena Vasquez received the strangest invitation of her life.
The testing began on the morning of the 3rd day. Elena was not first. The protocol, Counselor Veth explained, was to test in reverse order of flagged potential. Subjects whose behavioral data showed the least similarity to the theoretical complete external focus profile went first, working toward the subject whose data showed the most. Elena was last. She sat in the observation area with the other waiting subjects and watched. The Grethely strategist went first, 6 eyes, 4 centuries of military experience, the kind of calm that came from having made decisions that affected billions of lives and learned to carry that weight without being crushed by it. He sat in the chair. He looked at the weapon. He was, by every external measure, completely still. When the weapon fired, he moved. Not dramatically, half an inch to the left, barely perceptible, but the scanners caught it, and the readings showed what they always showed. The survival instinct firing in the last fraction of a second, overriding everything else. The gene did not activate. The Mirok Elder was next, then the Threxian commander, then one by one the others, each one representing the best their species had produced in terms of courage and training and the ability to face danger without breaking. Each one sitting in the chair, each one looking at the weapon, each one in the last fraction of a second before impact, moving. Some moved less than others. The Valari warrior, Commander Zale, last before Elena, barely moved at all, a single micro-contraction of the left shoulder, invisible to the eye, caught by the scanners. The gene flickered. The reading showed something that made several researchers straighten up, but did not activate. He came back to the waiting area with the composed expression of someone who was not going to show frustration and was finding this moderately difficult. He sat down beside Elena. They sat in silence for a moment. "The shoulder," Elena said quietly. Zale looked at her. "Yes." "Old injury?" A pause. "Yes, combat, 12 years ago." He was quiet. "I did not realize it still—" He stopped. "The body remembers things the mind forgets," Elena said. Zale looked at her for a long moment. "You are not concerned about failing," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm concerned about a lot of things. Failing isn't one of them." "Why not?" Elena looked at the door that led to the test room. "Because failing means the gene doesn't activate. That just means I'm like everyone else. That's fine." She paused. "There are worse things than being like everyone else." Zale watched her. "And if it does activate?" "Then Counselor Veth gets his data," Elena said. "And maybe whatever they find helps someone, somewhere, eventually." She shrugged. Either way, someone had to sit in the chair. The door opened. A researcher appeared. "Sergeant Vasquez?" Elena stood up. She looked at Zale. "Either way," she said again, and walked toward the door. The room was exactly as she remembered it from the briefing holographics. Smooth white walls, the chair, the weapon on its platform, 12 feet away, already charged, the transparent barrier with 17 scientists behind it, the same 17, plus Kel Soren, standing slightly back from the others with a data recorder and the careful expression of someone trying to be professionally composed. Elena walked to the chair, sat down, looked at the weapon.
It looked back at her with the flat, indifferent face of something that did not care about any of this. Counselor Veth's voice came through the communication panel. "Sergeant Vasquez, you understand the parameters of the test?" "Yes," Elena said. "You understand that the weapon will fire in 60 seconds from my mark. You understand that you are aware of this. You understand that the weapon will cause significant physical harm at this range." "Yes," Elena said again. "The only variable is your response." A pause. "Are you ready?" Elena looked at the weapon. She thought about Proxima Colony, the 12-year-old girl, the artillery strike coming in, and the decision that hadn't felt like a decision, just the only thing that made sense in that moment. She thought about Kepler perimeter, leaving cover, the specific silence of a battlefield when you are the only thing moving in it. She thought about Vel Minor, the Krathel, the civilian researchers behind her, the weapon in her hand that she had known with complete mathematical certainty that was not going to be enough. She thought about all three moments and what they had in common, and realized, sitting in a white room with a weapon pointed at her, that she had never been able to explain it to anyone who asked, why she had done those things, why they had felt in the moment not like courage, and not like sacrifice, and not like any of the words that got used afterwards in reports and citations. They had felt like the only option. Not because there was no other option. There always was. There always is. You can always choose yourself. The body will always suggest it, loudly, urgently. But in those moments, Proxima Colony, Kepler perimeter, Vel Minor, Elena Vasquez had simply not been thinking about herself at all. Not as a choice, not as discipline, not as training. Just the person behind her had mattered more than the weapon in front of her, simply, completely, without calculation. She looked at the weapon. She looked sideways, at Kel Soren, standing 2 steps closer to the barrier than everyone else, trying to see the readings better, standing, without realizing it, in the exact projected discharge path if the weapon's energy passed through or around the chair. Kel was looking at her data recorder, not at Elena, not at the weapon, at the recorder, nervous, professional, doing her job, completely unaware. The 60 seconds began. Elena watched the seconds move. Not on a clock, she didn't need one. 11 years of military service gave her an internal sense of time that was accurate within fractions of a second. She knew where she was, she knew how long she had. She looked at the weapon. She looked at Kel. She looked at the weapon again. The biometric scanners behind the barrier began showing something at the 40-second mark. Counselor Veth leaned forward. The researcher beside him made a small sound. The data on their screens was doing something it had not done in 3,000 years of this test. Not spiking, not surging, not showing the sharp, anxious peaks of a being's survival instinct beginning to fire. Showing instead,
The testing began on the morning of the 3rd day. Elena was not first. The protocol, Counselor Veth explained, was to test in reverse order of flagged potential. Subjects whose behavioral data showed the least similarity to the theoretical complete external focus profile went first, working toward the subject whose data showed the most. Elena was last. She sat in the observation area with the other waiting subjects and watched. The Grethely strategist went first. 6 eyes, 4 centuries of military experience, the kind of calm that came from having made decisions that affected billions of lives and learned to carry that weight without being crushed by it. He sat in the chair. He looked at the weapon. He was, by every external measure, completely still. When the weapon fired, he moved. Not dramatically, half an inch to the left, barely perceptible, but the scanners caught it, and the readings showed what they always showed, the survival instinct firing in the last fraction of a second, overriding everything else. The gene did not activate. The Mirok Elder was next, then the Threxian commander, then one by one the others, each one representing the best their species had produced in terms of courage and training and the ability to face danger without breaking, each one sitting in the chair, each one looking at the weapon,
each one in the last fraction of a second before impact, moving. Some moved less than others. The Valari warrior, Commander Zale, last before Elena, barely moved at all, a single micro-contraction of the left shoulder, invisible to the eye, caught by the scanners. The gene flickered. The reading showed something that made several researchers straighten up, but did not activate. He came back to the waiting area with the composed expression of someone who was not going to show frustration and was finding this moderately difficult. He sat down beside Elena. They sat in silence for a moment. "The shoulder," Elena said quietly. Zale looked at her. "Yes." "Old injury?" A pause. "Yes, combat. 12 years ago." He was quiet. "I did not realize it still—" He stopped. "The body remembers things the mind forgets," Elena said. Zale looked at her for a long moment. "You are not concerned about failing," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm concerned about a lot of things. Failing isn't one of them." "Why not?" Elena looked at the door that led to the test room. "Because failing means the gene doesn't activate. That just means I'm like everyone else. That's fine." She paused. "There are worse things than being like everyone else." Zale watched her. "And if it does activate?" "Then Counselor Veth gets his data," Elena said. "And maybe whatever they find helps someone, somewhere, eventually." She shrugged. Either way, someone had to sit in the chair. The door opened. A researcher appeared. "Sergeant Vasquez?" Elena stood up. She looked at Zale. "Either way," she said again, and walked toward the door. The room was exactly as she remembered it from the briefing holographics. Smooth white walls, the chair, the weapon on its platform, 12 feet away, already charged, the transparent barrier. The medical team arrived in 40 seconds, faster than their stated response time, because several of them had been watching the scanner feeds and had started moving before the formal call went out. Elena sat on the edge of the chair while they worked on her left arm, with the patient cooperation of someone who had been worked on by medical teams before, and understood that arguing with them about whether you needed attention was a waste of everyone's time. The arm was going to need proper treatment. She knew it. They knew it. Everyone was professional about it. Counselor Veth stood at the barrier and looked at his data screens and said nothing for a very long time. The other 12 test subjects had gathered at the observation window above. Commander Zale, the Threxian commander, the Grithali strategist, all of them watching in silence. Several of them were looking at Elena. Several were looking at the scanner readings they were still cycling through their restart sequences. Several were doing both, rapidly. Kel Soren had not moved from where Elena had told her to step back to. She was still holding her data recorder. It was still running. Her hands were not shaking. She was, Elena noted, more controlled than her age and expression suggested, but she was very still in the way that people go still when something has just happened near them that they have not yet fully processed. After the medical team had done what they could in the field and indicated that Elena needed to move to the medical level for proper treatment, Elena stood up. She looked at Veth through the barrier. "Can you tell me what the readings showed?" she said. Veth looked up from his screen. He looked, for the first time since Elena had met him, like someone who was choosing his words with extreme care, not because of diplomatic training, but because the words he needed did not quite exist yet. "The resonance gene activated," he said. "I gathered," Elena said. "At a level—" He stopped. "In 3,000 years of this research, our theoretical models have suggested a maximum possible activation level, a ceiling, the highest output the gene could theoretically produce based on the biological architecture of every known species." He looked at his screen. "Your activation exceeded that ceiling by a factor of 3. Silence. "That's not possible," the Threxian commander said from the observation window above, not argumentatively, just the flat statement of someone whose understanding of physics was telling them something. "No," Veth agreed. It is not possible according to our models. He looked at Elena. Which means our models are wrong, which means 3,000 years of theoretical framework needs to be revisited. He paused. From the beginning. Elena was quiet for a moment. The medical team hovered. Why did it exceed the ceiling? She asked. Veth looked at his data for a long moment. Our models, he said slowly, were built on the assumption that the gene activates in response to the subject's own mortal danger. The ceiling was calculated based on that assumption, how much neurological output a being can produce in response to a threat to itself. He paused. But your gene did not activate in response to a threat to you. No, Elena said. It activated, Veth said, in response to a threat to someone else. He looked up. And apparently, that produces a completely different output, one our models did not account for, one our ceiling did not account for. He was quiet. Because in 3,000 years, we never saw it. We never saw a being in that chair who was not, at the critical moment, thinking about themselves. The room was very quiet. Commander Zale's voice came from the observation window above, very controlled, very precise. Are you saying, he said, that the gene is more powerful when activated for someone else than when activated for yourself? I am saying, Veth said carefully, that the difference is not marginal. Based on these readings, he looked at the data, the output we recorded today is not slightly above our ceiling. It is not significantly above our ceiling. He paused. It is in an entirely different category, a category we did not know existed. Silence again. 3,000 years, the Grathali strategist said quietly from somewhere in the observation group. 3,000 years of testing, and we were always looking for the wrong thing. We were always testing the wrong question, Veth said. He looked at Elena. We were asking, can a being face its own death without flinching? That is not the question. What's the question? Elena said. Veth was quiet for a moment. Can a being, he said, care more about someone else's life than their own, completely, without reservation, in the moment when everything in their biology is telling them otherwise? He looked at his screen. That is what activates the gene. That is what it was designed for. That is what 3,000 years of testing missed entirely, because we never thought to look for it, because we assumed. He stopped. You assumed it was about survival, Elena said. Yes. Self-survival, she said. Yes. Elena looked at the discharge mark on the barrier wall behind her, at the chair, at the weapon platform, powered down now, indifferent. Where I come from, she said quietly, we have a word for what you're describing. Veth looked at her. What word? Elena picked up her jacket from the back of the chair with her working arm. We just call it looking out for each other. The emergency assembly of the full Galactic Council took 4 hours to convene, senior members traveling from across the known galaxy to a facility that had never before required an emergency assembly in its 300-year history. Elena spent those 4 hours in the medical level, having her left arm properly treated, drinking more coffee. Kel had appeared with a fresh pot 20 minutes after Elena arrived in medical, which Elena considered an excellent demonstration of priorities, and answering questions from a rotating series of researchers who came in with data pads and left with more questions than they had arrived with. Kel itself stayed. She sat in a chair in the corner of the medical room and processed what had happened with the focused internal silence of someone doing serious work. Elena let her. After 2 hours, Kel said, "You knew I was in the discharge path." Elena said, "Yes." "How?" Elena said, "I was watching the room. You moved forward. The weapon's discharge spreads at this range. The barrier would have deflected most of it, but the gap at your position." She paused. "It was a geometry problem." Kel stared at her. "You solved a geometry problem in 60 seconds while a weapon was pointed at your face?" Elena said. It wasn't the hardest part of my morning." Kel was quiet for a long moment. "You could have just stayed in the chair. The discharge was aimed at the chair. You would have taken the hit anyway. That was the test. You didn't have to move toward me. You could have just—" Elena said, "I know." "Then why?" Elena looked at her. "Because you didn't know you were in the path," she said simply. "And I did." Kel stared at her for a long time with the expression of someone standing in front of a door they had previously not known existed and trying to decide what was on the other side of it. "In Plejaren culture," Kel said slowly, "there is a concept, very old, very honored, the idea of placing yourself between harm and another. We have ceremonies for it, teachings. It is considered the highest—" She stopped. "But it is theoretical. It is something we revere in principle, something we teach our children to aspire to." She paused. "I have never seen anyone actually do it. Just do it, without ceremony, without—" Elena said, "It's not complicated." "For you," Kel said quietly. Elena considered this. "My grandmother," she said, "used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding something else is more important than the fear." She paused. "I think she was talking about something smaller than what your council is measuring, but the principle is the same." Kel looked at her for a long moment. Then she refilled Elena's coffee without being asked, which Elena decided was the correct response to the situation. The full council assembly took place in the largest chamber in the facility, a circular room that could seat 400 beings and currently held 312, every one of them a senior member of the governing body that oversaw the known galaxy. 312 beings from hundreds of species, filling the tiered seats in absolute focused attention. Counselor Veth presented the data. He presented it thoroughly, methodically, and without embellishment, because the data required no embellishment. The readings spoke for themselves. The comparison to 3,000 years of previous tests spoke for itself. The ceiling that had been exceeded spoke for itself. The chamber was very quiet throughout. When Veth finished, he stood in the center of the room and looked at 312 of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy and said, "We have been asking the wrong question for 3,000 years. We believed the resonance gene was a survival mechanism designed to activate when a being faces its own death and refuses to accept it. We built our entire theoretical framework on that assumption. We designed our test around that assumption.